All right, so this is part two of our muscle lecture, and we're going to start with the sliding filament theory, the neuromuscular junction, and talk about muscle contraction. So when muscles contract and relax, they get shorter, and then they relax, they get longer. They get that information to do that, the stimulus to do that from your nervous system. So let's take a look at what's happening in this upper box. Your muscle your muscles respond to the nerve impulses coming from your motor neurons. So the word motor neuron is what you want to remember for the kind of neurons. So here's the term motor neuron that come and stimulate your muscles to contract. The motor neuron is going to receive this information basically from the brain, right? You're going to think about contracting because this is voluntary muscle. And so the brain's going to send the signal down the motor neuron, and then the impulse. So I'm going to call this red arrow, it has two names: action potential, which is basically an electrical charge that goes across the membrane. Action potentials are also called impulses. So I kind of flip between the two. So I'm sorry if that's confusing, but impulse or action potential is the same thing. So I'll try to stick with action potential. Action potential comes down to the end of the neuron, which is called the axon terminal. And you guys should remember that from the chapter we talked really quickly about neurons, that the axon is going to be the part of the neuron that brings messages away and talk to the end. So the very, very end of a neuron is called the synaptic terminal, also called axon terminal. But what's happening here, so you see how the arrow is coming up, we have neurotransmitters. So your nervous system talks to other tissues with chemicals, and those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are stored in the synaptic terminal in little vesicles called synaptic vesicles. The neurotransmitter that's used for muscle contraction is acetylcholine. It's abbreviated ACH. All right, so I want you to know how to spell out and how to write out acetylcholine. So the acetylcholine is stored here, and it waits for an action potential coming from the neuron, right? And when the action potential reaches the end, it actually causes the acetylcholine to be released into the cleft. So when the acetylcholine is released into the cleft, and by the way, let's pause here, the neurons never touch the tissue that they're talking to, the cells that they're talking to. There's always a little gap or a cleft in between, and that space is where the neurotransmitters will be secreted, and that space is where they're going to be also broken down. We'll look at that. So notice on the other side, on the muscle sarcolemma side, right? So this is the sarcolemma because this is the muscle cell. We have an ACH receptor, so we have an acetylcholine receptor. So the acetylcholine gets put into the cleft, it binds to the receptor, and then that binding will cause an action potential to be created on the muscle itself. So the muscle's membrane acts just like the neuron's membrane in how it creates an action potential. So let's take a look at these steps, right? So here comes the synaptic terminal. So the action potential comes down, it releases those neurotransmitters into the cleft. So step one, acetylcholine is released, binding to the receptors on the muscle sarcolemma. So that action potential that begins, number two, right? Action potential reaches our transverse tubules or T tubules. So remember I talked about how the sarcolemma has those pores. So the reason for that is because we want that electrical impulse to come into the muscle fiber. So it's going to travel along the muscle sarcolemma down the T tubule, and the T tubules are going to come very close to our organelle, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Why? Because that action potential is going to stimulate the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. When calcium is released into the muscle fiber, it's going to bind to a specific site on actin. And I will go into that in just a second. But what calcium does is it allows the myosin head, so this little purple guy is myosin, the little arm sticking up here is the myosin head, only when calcium is present can myosin bind to actin and do the pulling action that allows the actin to slide past myosin and meet in the middle for muscle contraction. So that's why it's called the sliding filament theory, because what happens is the actin slides past myosin and meets in the middle. So calcium is required for that binding to happen, okay? And then contraction can begin, and then the myosin heads work all the time to bring actin in towards the middle. So let's take a look at what's really going on. So here's calcium. We'll start at the very top. Here's calcium. Here's actin in green. Notice that actin has, it's kind of like a little olive. So there's the round actin unit, and then we have this dark green area. That dark green area is where the myosin head binds. So there is a protein called troponin. Actually, it's not in your notes. Don't worry about the name of the protein. But there's a protein, this orange guy, that is going to sit and block the myosin head binding site if calcium is not present. When calcium is present, it's going to allow this protein to move out of the way so that the myosin head can actually bind to actin. Okay, so again, when calcium is not around, the myosin head binding site on actin, that dark green spot, is covered up. Literally, you cannot contract the muscle because the myosin head cannot bind to actin. When calcium is present, the calcium moves that little orange protein out of the way and exposes the myosin head binding site. That way, myosin can actually bind to actin and then start the contraction. Okay, so that's how calcium is important. Calcium allows the myosin head binding site to get exposed on the actin filament. So here's your myosin head. So we also need ATP. So that makes a lot of sense because muscle contraction takes energy, and this is ATP. So ATP is going to actually bind to the myosin head. So what the myosin head does, it has two positions, and switching between the positions is called a power stroke. So you see how it's kicked back? It leans back a little bit. It's going to then attach to actin, and it's going to move. So it's going to go move actin towards the left of the screen. So it's going to do a little switch in position, and that's called a power stroke. So the arrow shows you the power stroke. Because it's moving in this way, and it's attached to actin, it's also going to move actin in that way. So think about that Z line, right? Or the myosin getting the actin and then pulling it towards the M line in your sarcomere. So that's called a power stroke, and that's what is done by the myosin head. After a power stroke is done, ATP is required to kick it back into the starting position, right? So ATP attaches to myosin, and the myosin head detaches. So if you don't have any energy, if there's no ATP, then the myosin head kind of stays attached to actin and it doesn't move anymore. But if you do have ATP, the myosin head detaches and then it can go back in its original position and then do another power stroke. Okay, cocking of the myosin head is so you see how ATP is present and then ATP has been used, right? So ATP is actually used to go back into that first position. Then we're ready to do another power stroke. So as long as calcium is present, you will always get these power strokes done because the myosin head can bind to actin, and also as long as there's ATP present, we can keep contracting the muscle. Okay, so we need both calcium and ATP to have muscle contraction occur. So let's look at relaxation. Okay, so let's again, right, we have acetylcholine creating an impulse. When it binds to the receptors on the sarcolemma, the impulse travels down the T-tubules. The impulse allows calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And this organelle, by the way, that's its job. Its job is to store calcium for muscle contraction. Calcium comes out, it binds to that protein on actin, it moves that protein so that the myosin head binding site is exposed, myosin can bind, and as long as there's ATP there, it's going to keep doing power strokes to contract the muscle when contraction begins. All right, so let's say we want to relax our muscles now, right? What needs to happen? So what happens is the motor neuron is going to stop sending signals because your brain, you're making a decision to relax your muscles. So you're going to stop sending those signals. And what happened to the acetylcholine here? So what happens in the nervous system is that once neurotransmitters are released into the cleft, they are removed right away. So they're either completely broken down, and there's another mechanism called reuptake. We'll talk about that in the nervous system. But in this case, that neurotransmitter is removed. It's actually broken down by an enzyme, and the enzyme is called acetylcholine esterase. So I have acetylcholine esterase written down in your notes, and I'm looking for it now. I didn't bold it. I should have bolded it. But acetylcholine esterase is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine for relaxation. I actually don't see that. If it's not, I'm just scanning my notes right now. If it's not there, you need to know acetylcholine esterase. Well, let me show you where it is. So this picture here, you see these little half moon guys? So that's acetylcholine esterase, okay? So ACHE molecules. That's an enzyme. It's sitting right in the cleft. And so once acetylcholine gets secreted into the cleft, these guys break it down. So we have, when you want to relax your muscles, the acetylcholine is removed by the enzyme. Therefore, the impulse or the action potential stops on the muscle side, right? So you don't see any red line here. So that means that this sarcoplasmic reticulum is not going to secrete its calcium anymore. In fact, what it does is it actively takes up those calcium ions. So it's kind of like a vacuum cleaner cleaning up after contraction. It pumps those calcium ions back in. Without calcium ions present, remember that actin is going to have that binding site covered up. So you physically can't contract your muscles because myosin has nothing to bind to. And then the muscle just slides back, the sarcomere slides back to its original length, and that's relaxation. Okay, so there are many steps to it, but you should know all those things I just talked about in muscle relaxation, contraction and relaxation. You should know the role of calcium, you should know the role of ATP, you should know the role of T-tubules, sarcoplasmic reticulum. So basically everything I talked about, you want to know fairly well. All right, so that is muscle contraction, and that was really a little bit of a physiology sneak preview. So you're going to get that again in physiology, just with more details. So let's move on to the next topic here, which is going to be the motor unit. Before we do, just looking at these pictures, so this is that innervation. So we have the muscle fiber itself, and then we have these black, they look like little buttons, right? That's actually the synaptic terminal or axon terminal, and you can see that, so here's the axon coming in, right? So that junction between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber is called a synapse, neuromuscular synapse. Neuro for nerve, muscle, synapse. A synapse is when you have the neuron talking to, communicating with another cell. Okay, so let's answer this question. This should be quite easy. The red dots represent acetylcholine. All right, so this is a motor unit. So when you contract your muscles are innervated. The word innervated means the nerves coming into and controlling those muscles by more than one neuron, right? So take a look at these 3 motor neurons, and they actually live, the body of these motor neurons live in your spinal cord. And then the long axon leaves the spinal cord and comes and innervates your muscle. So notice that the purple muscle fiber controls only the purple the purple motor neuron controls the purple muscle fibers. The blue motor neuron only controls the blue muscle fibers, and the red motor neuron only controls the red muscle fibers. So a motor unit is each color. So a motor unit is defined as the motor neuron, right? One motor neuron, and the number of motor muscle fibers it controls or it innervates. Turns out that your body can have big and small motor units. So you can have one motor neuron controlling one muscle fiber, or you can have one motor neuron controlling 1,000 muscle fibers, okay? So think about the precision of movement. If you have one motor neuron controlling one muscle fiber, you can get very precise movement. Very fine, small movements, precise movements. Let's think about a larger motor unit. So one motor neuron controlling 1,000 muscle fibers. That's not going to give you as precise of a movement. It's going to give you more of a gross movement. So that's okay, because there's parts of your body that you don't need precise movement. So think about your really large muscles like the latissimus dorsi, big muscles in your back, the trapezius, your calf, the gastrocnemius. Those muscles don't need to be precise. They just need to be strong. So they're going to have larger motor units. But muscles that control your eye movement, that is a very precise motion, right? To move your eye very, very small amounts. So those motor units will be very small because you want precise movement. Okay, so letter B, the muscle fibers of different motor units are intermingled for even force throughout the muscle. So think about this scenario. Let's say that we have the purple motor unit firing only. The purple motor neuron is giving instruction to contract. Your entire muscle, because those purple fibers are kind of mixed into your muscle, your entire muscle will contract evenly. Even though it's just a little bit of contraction, the entire muscle contracts evenly because the purple fibers are evenly spread throughout the muscle. Think about the alternative where if all of your purple fibers were on one side of your muscle and only that one motor unit fired, then you'd have this weird scenario where just like one part of your muscle is contracting where the other parts are relaxed. So your muscle units tend to be intermingled so they can create an even force throughout the whole muscle. So this comes to the idea of recruitment. So when you lift something up, so let's just pretend you're lifting up a pencil, right? And so imagine doing a bicep curl and you're doing it with a pencil. How much muscle strength do you need to pick up that pencil? Very, very little. So maybe one motor unit is firing. Okay, so maybe just the purple. You only need to fire a few muscle fibers in order to pick up that pencil, right? So let's trade that pencil for a 10-pound dumbbell. You're going to need a lot more strength, a lot more force to lift the dumbbell in the same way. So you're going to recruit more motor units. You're going to have all 3 motor units firing so that you can engage all of your muscle fibers, right? So that's going to be one factor in the strength and how much force your muscles are creating, is how many motor units are firing. And your body will recruit more motor units as required to deal with the stimulus, what your muscle needs to do. So that is, if you look at letter C, the amount of tension on a muscle is the number of motor units involved. Okay. There's also the frequency of stimulation. So so you see this arrow, right? This is an action potential. So how many action potentials are we getting per second? Are we just getting a couple? Then you're not going to have a lot of muscle tension. If you're getting 100, you're going to get a lot of muscle tension, right? Because you're constantly stimulating these cells to fire. So basically, the amount of force or tension your muscle creates is a mix of both the number of motor units and how frequently you're getting that stimulation to contract. So we talked about recruitment. Recruitment is this slow and steady increase in muscular tension produced by increasing the number of active motor units. But when they're all contracting at the maximum rate, this is called peak tension. Basically, you've maxed out how much muscle tension you can create, right? You're using the full capacity of your muscle. And what's funny is, and what's really not funny, but interesting is that if you want to contract your muscles fully, but sustain the contraction. So let's say you're doing like a plank. You're trying to hold like a 2-minute, 3-minute plank, or you're doing a wall sit, like something where you take a lot of energy for a period of time. You want to sustain the contraction. Your motor unit is going to rotate on a basis. So basically what happens is your blue and red motor units will work while your purple ones take a break. So they're going to come offline. And then when they recover, then your blue motor unit will take a break. And then your purple and red will fire. And then the red one gets to take a break. So that is this rotating basis of motor unit activation, which is really cool. So you can sustain the contraction because parts of your muscle are taking a break at one time. All right, so let's take a look at some terms. The size of muscle. This is actually a picture of atrophy. Sorry, this is number 2. Atrophy is a decrease in muscle mass. So take a look at this calf here and then this calf here. This is very small compared to this one. This person had their leg in a cast. Your muscles will shrink with disuse. And maybe we're all finding this with COVID, being trapped in our houses or online in front of a computer all the time, that we're just not moving around enough, and your muscles can get smaller if you don't keep up with an exercise regime, right? So atrophy is each muscle fiber gets smaller. Each muscle fiber is going to break down the amount of protein it has in it. Those myofibrils will start to go away because you're not using your muscles. Your body's like, why are we maintaining all this muscle tissue when we're not using it? So it'll break it down. Each muscle fiber gets smaller and you get overall a smaller muscle. So this can happen with disuse. In a cast is the most dramatic example where you just cannot use the muscle. And then also, just an interesting thing, being on the planet Earth, we always have gravity that is acting against our body. So we have to have some kind of muscle just to hold our body up and maintain posture. Astronauts that go into space actually lose about 40% of their muscle mass before coming back because they just don't use their muscles. They don't need to, they're floating. So astronauts have to have a very intense exercise regime. And you can see this guy's tethered down to a treadmill so they can keep their muscle mass. Hypertrophy is different. So hypertrophy is where you get bigger muscles. So look at this. So this is an untrained muscle. Look at the number of nuclei. So this is, before exercising. This is your first training route. So look what happens. The muscle fiber itself, you see this guy? That's a myosatellite cell. That's your stem cell. So with the stimulus, with this extra force that you're demanding on your muscles, the muscles will increase in size. And the way it does that is by absorbing these myosatellite cells. It just becomes part of your muscle fibers. So after you work out and you become, you work your muscles out, you have larger muscles, it's because each muscle cell, each muscle fiber has become larger. It absorbed those extra cells from the myosatellite, but also those myofibrils, you're increasing the amount of myofibrils in those cells. So when you detrain, so you take a break, it's off season or whatever it is, your muscles will get smaller, right? But look at the difference between previously trained and untrained. So previously trained looks different than untrained, right? So when you retrain, it's actually easier to get back to hypertrophy. So you guys might have experience with this, where the first time you do something, it is very difficult to get into shape. But after you've been in shape, getting back into shape is not so hard. Anyways, but there's an anatomical difference. And so this picture here shows you the difference between sort of normal, you see the outline of a normal size muscle fiber, and then look at the hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is huge, right? Look at how large these muscle cells can get. So just an example of what happens when you get larger muscles. All right, so our last topic, and then muscle tone, sorry to skip that. Muscle tone is where you're at rest, so you're not moving your body at all, but your muscles will actually have a little bit of tension on them. And let me go back and just show you the motor unit, because so when you have muscle tone, that means that your muscle is a little tiny bit contracted, even at rest. So you have a motor neuron firing slow action potentials, right? Just to give enough contraction, just to give enough little, what they call tone. It's not enough to move anything, but it's just a little bit of contraction. And so that actually increases with exercise. So you know that people who are toned, right, their muscles look kind of big all the time, it's because they do have a little bit of contraction going on at all times. So that's muscle tone. But even someone who's not, fit will always have muscle tone. Your muscle, it's anybody has muscle tone. As long as you're alive, you have muscle tone. Okay, so let's talk about the last topic here, which is going to be our muscle fiber types. And so you're born with a ratio of different kinds of muscle fibers, and the kinds are called, they're in your notes 3, 4, and 5. So they're slow twitch or slow oxidative fibers. SO stands for slow oxidative. FG stands for fast glycolytic. They're also called fast twitch. And then FO, which is fast oxidative, which is a kind of a blend between the two. So genetically, you're born with a mix of these different kinds of muscle fibers in every muscle. Okay, so every single muscle you have will have a mix of these different fiber types, and they look the same, but they're going to behave, well, they don't actually look the same. They're going to behave differently based on how they use energy, how they respond to contraction. So let's take a look at the differences. So I know this is kind of a very heavy chart. I'm just going to go through it and make it more understandable. So slow twitch, this is going to be our slow oxidative. Fast twitch A and fast twitch X. So this intermediate, this is going to be what we're calling the intermediate one, okay? And then this one's going to be called fast twitch. This is letter number 4 in our notes, and then this will be our fast oxidative. So the two ends of the spectrum on the sides, and the one in the middle is in the middle. Okay, so let's just talk about oxygen. So your muscle cells, it turns out, use oxygen, but then some don't. Aerobic or oxidative capacity. So your slow twitch muscles are aerobic, so they require oxygen to work. They need oxygen. Then you can see that the oxygen use goes down with fast. So fast, intermediate, those fast oxidative use oxygen, but moderately, and then your fast twitch is a low oxygen usage. And actually, if you look at your notes, they tend to be anaerobic, so they sometimes don't even use oxygen. So what if you don't use oxygen, then how do you contract, right? They're anaerobic, they're glycolytic, so they undergo fermentation. You should remember this from Bio 3. Fermentation is a process where you can actually make ATP, you can take glucose, break it down, make ATP without oxygen. So it turns out that these fast twitch fibers tend to be used, or they tend to make ATP in this way. They tend to ferment. This also, the intermediate tend to ferment. And then slow twitch, the ones that use oxygen, don't tend to do that. Okay, that should make sense to you. So oxygen is used to make ATP, right? So your slow twitch make ATP with oxygen. Your fast twitches make ATP usually with fermentation. Okay, so let's actually skip those a little bit here and talk about, let's see, the next part here. So let's keep this oxygen going. And it's not here, but because of the oxygen use in our slow twitch, if you look at your outline, notice that letter D and letter E and letter F, those are all related. So mitochondria is the organelle for cellular respiration, which is where oxygen is used. So if you're going to depend on oxygen, you're going to have a lot of mitochondria. If you need oxygen, what delivers oxygen to you? It's blood. So you're going to have a lot of blood supply. You're going to have a lot of capillaries. And that's actually listed in this picture. Capillaries per fiber, a lot of capillaries. Notice the capillary, the blood going to those tissues goes down in the other two. All right, so it's a lot of capillaries. And then there's myoglobin, which is not listed here, but myoglobin is a pigment. Okay, so look at letter F in your outline under slow oxidative. Myoglobin is bolded. You should know that it's a pigment that's found in these slow twitch fibers that binds to oxygen and stores it. It's an oxygen reserve. Because these fibers depend so much on oxygen, you have a protein that stores oxygen for you in these fibers. It's not present in the other two fibers. So this protein is what makes these fibers darker in color, which is sometimes why they're called red fibers. Let me just show you the difference, right? R for red. Look at how dark this shows up on the picture. The other fibers, so slow fibers are darker because of that myoglobin that they have. I will also say that the number of mitochondria they have and the blood supply going to them will also make these areas dark. The white fibers, right, the white or fast glycolytic are pale in comparison because they do not have myoglobin. You can also see another characteristic that slow fibers have a smaller diameter, they're thinner, and fast fibers have a larger diameter, they're thicker. Because of the thin and thick, the slow fibers really can't generate a powerful contraction. These are not your deadlifting, powerlifting muscle fibers. If you're a deadlifter, powerlifter, you want explosive, or sprinter, you want explosive amount of power in a very short amount of time, you want to rely on your fast fibers. Fast fibers, because they're so large, they can actually generate a lot of power. Also, let's just talk about the name slow versus fast. Slow means that it's slow to contract. So these fibers are really good for sports or actions that really don't need you to be very explosive or quick, but endurance is important. So slow fibers are slow to contract, but they are fatigue resistant. They don't tire out. So things like holding a position in yoga, for example, or running distances, marathon runners, people who swim tons and tons of laps, right? Things, the endurance sports, they are going to want to have more red fibers in their body. These fast fibers are going to be what boxers want, what sprinters want. They want fast, explosive action, but these fatigue quickly. So you can't sprint for as long as you can run distance, right? You slow down because your muscles fibers fatigue. And let's talk about why they fatigue. So let's move to fast glycolytic fibers and look at letter F. Their dependence on anaerobic activity leaves them vulnerable to the accumulation of lactic acid, and they fatigue quickly. So remember that when you ferment, the byproduct of fermentation is called lactic acid. So these white fibers will produce lactic acid, and they're going to fatigue. Because the fast fibers rely on fermentation, and this is a inefficient way to make ATP, you'll notice that letter G in your outline, they have a lot of glycogen reserve. So they're going to have a lot of sugar in their tissues so that they can continuously burn those sugars to make ATP, because every time they burn a sugar, they just don't make as much ATP as the red fibers do. So they're going to have glycogen reserves in their cells. Okay, so I think I covered everything. Let's take a look at our chart again. So I did talk about the aerobic and anaerobic activity. Don't worry about the myosin ATPase. Don't worry about creatine phosphate. Don't worry about that. Lactate removal. So because remember I talked about the lactic acid buildup in our fast fibers, you want to remove that as quickly as possible, because if you build up those lactic acid molecules, your cells will start to fatigue and stop working. So you're going to remove those lactic acid in these two fast fibers at the highest rate, but not so much in the slow, because the slow doesn't generate as much lactic acid. I talked about the blood supply, a lot of blood supply for slow, not so much in the fast. Contractile velocity, right? So how fast do you contract? Slowly. That's why we named it slow twitch. Fast and fastest, okay? Don't worry about motor fibers per unit. The force, how much force can you generate? Slow twitch, not so much, right? This is for endurance, it's not for power. And then these two are for power. So there you go, low power, high power. So most humans, I'm just reading the thing here, most humans are born with approximately equal proportions of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. The FTA, this one in the middle, tends to predominate within the fast twitch category, and the percentage of FTX fibers is generally lower. So this is not as much. So you are born with a ratio of fast twitch versus slow twitch. But some people are born with just more slow twitch, and some people are born with a little bit more fast twitch, or that their fibers can train easier in one direction or the next. So you might be a distance runner where you just find that you can really run long distances and it's not so strenuous on you. And that means that you maybe have been born with more red twitch or slow twitch muscles, whereas someone who's naturally good at sprinting might have just been born with cells that train better to get those powerful. So you can train your fibers to go in one direction or the next, right? So if you go back up to your characteristics, number 1, and you look at letter E and F and G, this is basically talking about training. So intense, quick workouts will promote your fast twitch muscles. So if you are a boxer, right? If you are boxing and that's your training, you're going to be training those really fast twitch muscles because boxing is a fast, explosive action. And then, but if you are doing yoga, if you're doing some distance running, you're going to be training your slow twitch muscles. And then cross training is doing both kinds. So that is a little bit of information on the different kinds of muscles you have in the body. And which of the following is a characteristic of slow fibers? All right, so you should have concluded that A is the correct answer. They have a rich blood supply because they depend on oxygen. All right, so finally, we're going to wrap up with just some definitions about your muscle. So when you're studying your muscles, you're going to see that every muscle in your body has an origin and an insertion. So those are the 2 points of attachment for the muscles, right? The origin is defined as the more proximal attachment, and it's also going to be the attachment that does not move in a conventional action. So you're going to learn these standard actions that muscles have when you're in anatomical position. So the origin is the bone that does not move, and the insertion is the part that does move. So in this action here, you can see that the person is flexing their elbow. So the insertion is going to move towards the origin, and that's going to be true for all of your muscle contractions. When a muscle contracts, the insertion moves towards the origin, right? It has to, because the muscle is shortening. The muscles, if the origin is still, it's not moving anywhere, and it gets shorter, then what needs to happen? Then the insertion moves towards the origin. So the action is what's happening when that muscle contracts. In this example here, we have elbow flexion. We have the elbow coming up and closing off that joint angle, making that joint angle smaller. So that's what happens. So origin, insertion. Action is the main action that the muscle creates. And then we have the word prime mover, synergists, and antagonists. So prime mover is in an action, you usually have one muscle that does the bulk of the work. So in this action of contracting your biceps brachii is contracting. The action here is elbow flexion. There's actually 2 muscles here that create elbow flexion, your biceps brachii and your brachialis. The biceps brachii does most of the work, so it's going to be called the agonist. It's going to be called the prime mover or the agonist. The antagonist, so the way your muscles work is that there's always a muscle that does the opposite job, right? So if your biceps brachii flexes your elbow, the triceps brachii is going to extend the elbow and bring you back to a straight arm position. So the relationship between these two is agonist-antagonist. So you're always going to have an antagonist for an agonist, but that it can change. So let me just say that if we're talking about flexion of the elbow, so this picture, what's our agonist? Our agonist is going to be the one that creates the movement. So it's going to be our biceps brachii. What's the antagonist to the biceps? It's going to be the triceps, okay? However, if we look at the opposite action, if we say, okay, I want to talk about elbow extension, what's the muscle that's going to be responsible for extending our elbow? Now it's going to be the triceps brachii. And in this action, the triceps brachii is going to be the agonist, right? It's going to be the prime mover for elbow extension. And then the biceps becomes the antagonist. So when you think about agonist-antagonist relationships, you have to begin with the action. What's the action? What's the muscle that does that action? That's going to be your agonist. And then what's the muscle that is going to do the opposite action? That's going to be the antagonist. There's another term here called synergist. And a synergist is going to add extra force. So when I was talking about the biceps brachii and the brachialis doing the same action, they help each other, right? So the brachialis is going to be a synergist for the biceps brachii. They're going to work together. Another definition of synergist is something called a fixator. And a fixator is going to hold the bone still hold a bone still so the agonist is attached to, so you don't, you minimize unwanted movements. So I do have an example here where the elbow, during elbow flexion and extension, the shoulder muscles can hold the scapula down and in place so that you can really just focus on and only move the elbow. And so you have muscles that are around the scapula that hold the scapula still. Those would be called fixator muscles. So that's all we have. Lastly, just last little thing, as you guys move through the muscles, you're going to find that the muscles have very long names sometimes, but they are all trying to describe what the muscle does. So the word, these two muscles in your forearm are probably the longest names that you'll come across. Extensor carpi radialis longus, and then there's the muscle next to it, which is extensor carpi radialis brevis. So extensor carpi, it's an extending muscle. So extensor is going to increase your joint angle. Carpi is wrist, right? So it's going to extend the wrist. Radialis means it's on the radial side. So this is your ulna. Look, it's on top of the radius. And one of them is long and one of them is short. Okay, so extensor carpi radialis longus is a muscle that extends the carpus, extends the wrist. It's on the radius and it's long. Extensor carpi radialis brevis is, the same thing but short. So it's just a way of a heads up where these muscles are trying to be descriptive in terms of their position or their action, sometimes both. Sometimes it's their shape, like the deltoid muscle on your shoulder. It's shaped like a delta, a triangle. So that's why they call it deltoid. So we're going to go through and talk about each one in the recorded lectures. And so I just wanted to give you a heads up with muscle names. And that's it.